Do you take this woman? I can't do this.
Marcus.
I'm sorry.
There are moments in a woman's life that split everything in two. Before and after. The woman she was, and the woman she became. Most of those moments arrive quietly. A conversation that changes you, a decision made at 2 in the morning that no one else ever knows about, a day that looked ordinary from the outside and was anything but. But every now and then, one of those moments arrives loudly. Publicly. In front of 400 people who are dressed in their finest clothes and holding programs with your name printed inside. This is a story about one of those moments. And more importantly, this is a story about everything that came after it. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something about Claire Henderson. Not the Claire Henderson who would eventually sit at the head of a company she built from the ground up. Not the Claire Henderson whose name would appear in regional business publications, whose firm would expand across 4 states, whose opinion would be sought by people who once barely knew her name. I need to tell you about the Claire Henderson who existed before all of that. The woman who stood in a church vestibule in Columbus, Ohio on a Saturday morning in October, wearing a dress that had been altered 3 times, holding a bouquet of ivory garden roses, listening to the organ begin to play, and had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to her. Because understanding what she became requires understanding what she lost. And understanding what she lost requires you to understand, fully and completely, what she believed she had. And before we go any further into this story, we want to pause right here and say, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are not already subscribed to this channel, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We tell stories on this channel that do not make headlines but shape entire lives, and this one is among the most extraordinary we have ever brought to you. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Claire Henderson was born in 1974 in Dayton, Ohio, the eldest of 3 children raised by a schoolteacher mother and a father who worked for 31 years at a regional manufacturing plant. Her childhood was not wealthy, but it was stable, and stability, she would later say, was something she had always associated with love. Her mother taught 3rd grade for 27 years and came home every evening smelling faintly of chalk and hand sanitizer, and Claire grew up understanding without being told that work was not something separate from character, it was an expression of it. Her father coached her little league team until she was 12 and then coached her younger brother's team until his knees gave out at 52, and what she remembered most about him was not any particular game or moment but the consistency of him. The fact that he was always there. That he showed up, over and over, without drama and without expectation of recognition. She absorbed that. She internalized it in the way that children internalize the things they most admire about the people they love most. She was, by every account of people who knew her then, exceptional in the particular way that women who are exceptionally capable are often described, quietly. She graduated 2nd in her high school class. She earned a full academic scholarship to Ohio State University, where she studied finance and economics and discovered, to her own slight surprise, that she was not just competent at understanding how money moved and how businesses worked, she was genuinely fascinated by it. There was something that appealed to her deeply about the logic of it, the way numbers told stories that people often couldn't bring themselves to say out loud. She had a gift for seeing past the surface of a financial document and understanding the human decisions and human fears that had produced it. Her professors noticed. Her classmates noticed too, though some of them were better at hiding their noticing than others. She graduated in 1996 with honors and took a position at a financial consulting firm in Columbus. It was not the most glamorous offer she received. There was a Chicago firm that had approached her before graduation, a larger outfit with a recognizable name and a downtown office and the kind of starting salary that made her roommate's eyes go wide when Claire mentioned the number. But the Columbus position was solid, and it was close to home, and there was a man in Columbus that she had been seeing for 8 months and who had begun, cautiously, to feel like something real. So she chose Columbus. She told the Chicago firm thank you. She packed her apartment and drove 2 hours south with her mother's cassette tape of Bonnie Raitt playing the whole way, and she started her career in a city that still felt like home in the best possible way. His name was Marcus Cole. And I want you to understand Marcus Cole clearly, because the easiest version of this story, the version that is most satisfying and least complicated, would be to describe him as a villain. And he was not. What he was, which is in many ways far more frustrating and far more common than villainy, was a man who had spent his entire life being insulated from the full consequences of his own choices. Marcus Cole was 32 years old when he and Claire began dating seriously. He was the third generation of a Columbus family with deep roots in regional real estate and construction. His grandfather had built the business from almost nothing in the 1950s. His father had grown it into something respectable, something that employed dozens of people and had a name on the side of a building in downtown Columbus that made the Cole family feel, when they drove past it, like they had done something that mattered. Marcus had grown up inside that legacy rather than creating it, which is a very different thing, though men in his position often struggle to recognize the distinction. He was charming. That is the word that comes up again and again in the accounts of people who knew him from that period of his life. Charming, easy, magnetic in the way that men are magnetic when they have been told their whole lives that they are worth knowing. He was not dishonest in the obvious ways. He did not lie, exactly. But there was a particular quality to his presence that in hindsight, people would recognize as a kind of performance, a version of himself carefully curated for whoever was watching. He was the son his parents wanted to see when they looked at him. He was the friend that his friends believed him to be. And when he met Claire Henderson,
Marcus Cole.
Claire Henderson, I know who you are.
Most people say nice to meet you.
Most people.
Haven't read the archives.
You read archives for fun?
Company event in the fall of 1997, he became, quickly and convincingly, the man she believed he was. The man who was attentive and funny and who asked real questions and remembered the answers. The man who showed up when he said he would. The man who called when he said he would call. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. By that point, Claire was 26 and Marcus was 33, and what had begun as something cautious and careful on her part had, over those 2 years, become something she had allowed herself to count on. She had opened up to him in the way that women who are naturally self-contained open up to very few people, slowly over time, revealing the parts of herself that she did not display to the world at large. The ambition she kept quiet at work because she had learned early that ambitious women are managed carefully in rooms that are not yet ready to promote them. The longing for a family that she felt as a kind of background hum, constant and low. The opinion she held about everything from federal economic policy to the best way to make her grandmother's sweet potato pie, opinions that could be sharp and certain and that she had learned to soften in rooms where softening was required for the sake of peace. Marcus seemed to welcome all of it. He seemed to find her clarity attractive rather than threatening. He told her often that she was the smartest person he knew, and the way he said it did not sound like flattery. It sounded like he meant it. He proposed on a Thursday evening in the fall of 1999. He made a reservation at the restaurant where they had their first real dinner together, and he brought her mother's favorite flowers, which he had called her mother to ask about, and which had cost him 45 minutes on the phone pretending he was asking for reasons unrelated to what he was actually planning, and her mother, who was not a woman easily fooled, let him have the pretense because she liked him and because she liked what she saw in her daughter's face when she talked about him. Claire said yes. She cried a little. She did not cry often, and she was aware of that as it was happening, aware that something in her had been reached that was not easily reached, and that awareness was itself a kind of answer about what he meant to her. The engagement lasted 18 months. They set the date for October 2001. The venue was a historic church in the Columbus suburb where Marcus had grown up, large enough to seat 400 people comfortably, with stained glass windows that turned everything amber in the afternoon light. The guest list was large because the Cole family was large and well-connected and because Claire's mother had 3 sisters and each of those sisters had children and those children had children, and by the time both families had been accounted for there were more people than either of them had originally intended, but neither of them said so out loud because it seemed ungracious to say. Claire's dress was ivory with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that moved when she walked, and it had been altered 3 times over the 18 months, once when the first fitting revealed it did not sit quite right at the waist, once after she changed her mind about the neckline, and once in the final weeks simply because she wanted it to be exactly right. The last alteration happened on a Tuesday in late September, 10 days before the wedding, and the seamstress told her she looked beautiful, and Claire stood in front of the mirror in that shop for a long moment and thought that the woman looking back at her was someone she felt very good about becoming. She drove home with the dress in a garment bag laid across the back seat, and she remembered thinking that everything felt, at last, completely in order. What she did not know, what she could not have known, because no one told her, was that in those same final weeks, Marcus Cole was having a series of conversations that she was not part of. His father's health had begun to decline in ways that raised serious questions about the future of the family business. There were financial pressures that Marcus had been aware of in a vague and avoidable way for the better part of a year, but that had recently become specific and urgent. A major commercial development project that the Cole company had been counting on had stalled at the permitting stage, which meant a significant amount of capital had been tied up without the expected return. There were investor conversations that were not going well. And there was, though this is the part of the story that is most painful to account for, another woman. Not someone Claire knew, not someone who appears in this story in any direct way, but someone whose existence had been, for Marcus, a quiet and convenient exit from the full weight of a commitment he had begun to feel as a kind of constriction. He had not been honest about her. He had told himself, in the way that people tell themselves things when the truth is too uncomfortable to hold, that it was nothing serious, that it would resolve itself, that he would handle it before the wedding, that none of it needed to come to light. It did not resolve itself. He did not handle it. And on the Friday night before the wedding, as Claire was in a hotel room 3 miles away with her mother and her 2 sisters and her closest friends, being toasted with champagne and laughed at gently and cried over and loved in the particular way that the women in your life love you on the eve of the day you've been waiting for, Marcus Cole was sitting alone in his car in the parking lot of a gas station at midnight, not able to go home and not able to go forward. And something in him that night, instead of finding courage and choosing honesty, instead of calling her, instead of going to her, instead of doing the hard and necessary and right thing while there was still time to do it quietly and privately and with some measure of dignity for everyone involved, something in him decided to wait. To get to the morning. To see how the morning felt. The morning of October 13th, 2001 in Columbus, Ohio was the kind of fall morning that Ohio does better than almost anywhere else in the country. Clear and cold and the color of cider, with the maple trees in full red and gold and the kind of light that makes everything look considered, intentional, like a painting someone took their time with. Claire was awake at 6 in the morning. She had slept, surprisingly, better than she expected. Her mother came in and sat on the edge of the bed and didn't say anything for a long moment, just held her hand, which was the most eloquent thing her mother could have done. They had breakfast brought up to the room, eggs and toast and coffee, and Claire ate it at the window watching the parking lot fill with cars as the morning built, and she felt, she would say later, genuinely calm. Not the forced calm of someone pushing something down. Real calm. The kind that comes from feeling, at the base of yourself, that you have made the right decision. That the life you are walking toward is the life you actually want. She had no reason to feel otherwise. She had been given no reason to feel otherwise. Her sister buttoned the back of the dress. 42 buttons, each one small and white and covered in the same fabric as the skirt. It took 11 minutes. Claire stood very still in front of the window and counted the buttons in the mirror, not because she was counting, but because her mind needed something small and concrete to hold while her heart was doing something enormous. Her mother arranged the veil. Her best friend from college, a woman named Denise who had driven 14 hours from Houston for this day, stood in the doorway of the bathroom watching with her arms crossed and tears already working their way quietly down her face, and when Claire caught her eye in the mirror they both laughed at the same time, and that laughing was the last moment of pure lightness in that room. She arrived at the church at 11:45 for a noon ceremony. The parking lot was full. Through the closed wooden doors she could hear the murmur of 400 people settling into pews, the low notes of the organ warming up, the particular hum of a room full of people who are happy and expectant. Her father was waiting in the vestibule. He was wearing a suit she had never seen before. He had bought it specifically for this day, and when he turned to look at her his face did something complicated and quiet that fathers' faces do when they are proud in ways they do not have enough language for. He took her arm. He said only, "You look like your mother did." And that was enough. Inside the church, the organ shifted to the processional. The groomsmen and bridesmaids moved through their arrangements. And then the doors to the nave opened, and the congregation rose as one, and Claire Henderson took the first of what she would later count as 87 steps toward the altar. The light through the stained glass windows was exactly what the venue had promised it would be, amber and warm, falling across the pews in long diagonal lines. She could see faces along the aisle, people she had known her whole life and people she had met only twice and people who were the bridges between her world and his. She could hear the fabric of her dress moving. She could feel her father's arm under her hand. And at the end of those 87 steps, at the altar, she could see Marcus. He was watching her walk toward him. And his face, she would spend a long time, in the months that followed, trying to read what she had seen in his face in that moment. She had read it, at the time, as love. She had read it as the particular overwhelm of a man who is moved by what he is seeing. She had been, as it turned out, reading something else entirely. She reached the altar. Her father kissed her cheek and placed her hand in Marcus's hand and stepped to his seat, and the officiant began to speak. The congregation settled. The room went quiet in that specific way that sacred spaces go quiet when the thing everyone has come to witness is about to happen. Claire looked at Marcus. He looked at her. And then he leaned close to her, not close enough for anyone else in the room to hear, close enough only for her, and he said in a voice that was very quiet and very final 3 words.
I can't do this.
Marcus.
I'm sorry.
She thought she had misheard him. The acoustics in the church were unusual in certain spots, and she thought, for one specific second, that something had been distorted by the distance between his mouth and her ear. She asked him to repeat it. His jaw moved. He said it again. I can't do this, Claire. And the world, as she had been holding it in her mind for the last 18 months, stopped being what it was. What happened in the next 90 seconds has been described in slightly different ways by the different people who witnessed it, but the core of it does not change across any of the accounts. Marcus turned to the officiant. He said something that the officiant responded to with a look of confusion, and then very quickly an expression of something more grave. And then Marcus turned to face the congregation. For 100 people who were beginning to feel the first stirrings of something wrong, that particular shift in a room's collective body language when an audience realizes they are not watching what they thought they were watching. And he said, clearly enough for most people to hear, that he was sorry, that he was not going to be able to go through with the ceremony today, that he wished to apologize to everyone present, and that he hoped they would understand. There was no explanation beyond that. No name. No reason. Just an apology directed at 400 people, none of whom was the woman he had just left standing at the altar. And then he walked back up the aisle he had walked down 20 minutes earlier. He did not look at Claire. He did not look at her father. And the sound of them closing was the only sound in the room. And then 400 people turned, not all at once, but in a wave, like the instinctive movement of a crowd at a sporting event when something unexpected has happened. And they looked at Claire Henderson standing at the altar of that church in her ivory dress with her 42 buttons and her bouquet of ivory garden roses, and they waited to see what she was going to do. This is the moment, if you are a woman watching this video, that I suspect you have already been carrying in your chest since I first described it. Because there is something about imagining that specific moment, that specific public exposure, that specific variety of being seen in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time, that most women carry a visceral response to. The nightmare version of it. The thing you cannot imagine surviving. Claire Henderson survived it. She stood at that altar for what witnesses described as between 15 and 20 seconds, though several people said afterward that it felt much longer than that, and then she straightened. And she turned to face the congregation. And she said, in a voice that was steady in a way that no one in that room had any right to expect of her, the ceremony won't be going forward. I'm sorry to have brought you all the way here for this. The reception venue is paid for and the food is there, and I would love it if you would all stay and eat. Lord knows we could use the company. There was a pause. And then her mother stood up. And then her father stood up. And then, in a ripple that moved across the pews, other people stood. Some of them were crying. Claire was not. Not yet. She would cry later. She went to a small bathroom in the back of the church, one of those narrow utilitarian rooms that only exist in the ancillary corridors of large old buildings, and she locked the door, and she sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her dress billowing around her, and she cried for approximately 12 minutes. She has been precise about this number. 12 minutes. And then she stood up. She ran cold water over her wrists the way her mother had taught her to do whenever her body felt like it was running too hot. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She unlocked the door. And she went back out to be with her guests, because she had invited them, and because they had come a long way, and because she refused to spend one more minute alone in a room with what Marcus Cole had done to her when there were people on the other side of that door who loved her. The reception, as several people who were there would later describe it, was one of the strangest and most unexpectedly beautiful gatherings any of them had ever attended. The food was magnificent. The music played. Claire moved from table to table, stopping to speak with people, to thank them for coming, to hold the hands of the women who were crying and accept the embraces of the men who did not know what to say and said nothing, which was the right thing. Her sister stayed close to her the whole evening, 3 feet behind at all times, not speaking unless Claire spoke first, just there. Her best friend Denise, who had driven 14 hours from Houston, sat at the bar and fixed any man who looked like he was about to say something unhelpful with a stare that communicated, without a single word, that he should choose silence. And Claire moved through all of it with a grace that people described for years afterward, in ways that always came back to the same word, dignity. Claire Henderson, on the worst day of her life, had not lost a single molecule of her dignity. She had lost the man she planned to marry. She had lost the future she had been building in her mind for 2 years. She had lost, though she did not yet fully know this, the particular form of trust that comes from believing completely in someone who turns out not to be what you believed they were. But she had not lost herself. And in the aftermath of that day, that would matter more than anyone in that room yet understood. Marcus Cole left Columbus within 3 weeks of the wedding. He took a position with a regional property development group in Cleveland and told people, when asked, that he needed a fresh start, which was the most honest thing he had said in months. He did not call Claire before he left. He did not write. He sent no letter of explanation, no message of genuine reckoning, nothing that could be mistaken for an acknowledgement of what he had done and what it had cost her. He simply moved his life to a different city and assumed, in the comfortable and unexamined way of people who have never had to fully account for the damage they leave behind, that things would work themselves out. That she would be fine eventually. That time would take care of it. He was not entirely wrong. He was simply wrong about what fine was going to look like. The first year after the wedding that never happened was, in Claire's own accounting, the most difficult year of her adult life. Not because she fell apart. She did not fall apart in the visible dramatic way that some people expected and some people almost seemed to be waiting for. But because the grief of what she had been through was not the sharp, clean grief of loss. It was the complicated, layered grief of a woman who had organized her choices around a future that had been constructed on false ground. She had turned down the Chicago position, that good, smart, would not come around again opportunity, because she was building a life with Marcus in Columbus. That decision now lived in her body as a physical thing, a weight that was not quite regret and not quite anger and was something harder to name than either. She had let herself be known by him, trusted him with the parts of herself she protected in all other areas of her life, and he had treated the trust as something he could simply set aside when it became inconvenient. Working through that took time. It took the kind of quiet internal labor that no one around you can see or properly witness, which is perhaps the most exhausting kind. The town had its opinions, as towns always do. Some people were kind in the direct and useful way, practical, present, not making the situation about themselves. But there were also the ones who offered the kind of sympathy that is more about the giver's comfort than the receiver's need. The woman at the dry cleaner who told Claire she was probably better off, and let her eyes go somewhere knowing and sad, as though the appropriate response to having your wedding stopped publicly was to be immediately grateful about it. The former colleague who mentioned, over lunch 3 months later, that she had always wondered if Marcus was really ready to commit, a thing this person had never mentioned when it might have been useful, which is the particular nature of retrospective observations from people who did not say what they knew when they could have. Claire sat through all of it. She responded with patience that was not entirely natural to her, because she had grown up in a family that valued graciousness and because she understood, intellectually, that these people meant well even when their well-meaning landed badly. But she took note of it. She was the kind of woman who took note of things. She stayed at the financial consulting firm. She had no desire to leave, not because the job was everything she wanted, but because leaving would have felt, at that point, like another thing being taken from her. She showed up every morning and she worked harder than she had worked before, not in a manic or desperate way but in the measured, accumulating way of a woman who has decided that the only worthwhile response to having her plans dismantled is to build something better. She arrived before her supervisor most mornings. She stayed late most evenings. She was thorough in a way that went beyond what the job required, developing a habit of working through the full implications of every financial scenario she was given rather than simply executing the specific ask. She began keeping a separate notebook, a plain blue composition book she bought at a drugstore for $1.29, in which she wrote, not journaling but observing, companies she was working with that had obvious structural problems their leadership hadn't addressed. Patterns she noticed in how mid-size regional businesses managed, or failed to manage, their finances through transition periods. She was not yet thinking about what she would do with these observations. She was just keeping them, the way certain people keep things they recognize as valuable without yet knowing what they are. For 18 months after the altar, her firm took on a small regional manufacturing client, a machine parts company out of Springfield, Ohio, family-owned for 3 generations. The kind of business that the whole consulting industry had grown comfortable ignoring because the margins on small family-owned manufacturers were not exciting to anyone whose ambitions ran to bigger trophy accounts. The client came in through a contact of a contact and was assigned to a junior team, which was standard practice, and Claire was not officially on that team. But she knew the sector. She had done her reading. And the brief that the junior team put together for the client, competent, technically acceptable, thoroughly unremarkable, bothered her in a way she could not set aside, because she could see, clearly and from the outside, what the company's actual problem was, and the brief addressed it the way you address a symptom while leaving the underlying cause entirely untouched. So she did something that she had never done before and would never need to do again. On her own time, over the course of 3 evenings that stretched past midnight, she rebuilt the entire financial model for the Springfield company from the ground up. She used her blue composition notebook and her own research and 4 years of pattern recognition about what actually kills businesses that look like this one. She produced something that was, by any objective measure, significantly more useful than what the junior team had prepared. And then she looked at it for a long time. And then she did something that people who know her well say was entirely characteristic of her, even though it looked from the outside like a wild and impulsive act. She sent it directly to the client. The phone rang the next morning at 7:14. She was already at her kitchen table with her coffee. The voice on the other end was the owner of the Springfield Manufacturing Company, a man named Dale Patterson who had been running his family's machine parts business for 22 years and who was, by his own admission, exhausted and at the end of a very specific rope. He had read what she sent him. He had read it twice, actually, once the night it arrived and once again at 5 in the morning because he had been unable to sleep. And he wanted to know who she worked for. She told him the name of her firm. He said he understood that, but that was not what he had asked. He wanted to know who she worked for, meaning who had authorized this analysis and whether it was available to him. There was a pause. And then Claire Henderson said 4 words that changed the direction of her life. Right now? Just myself. Dale Patterson said he would like to meet with her that week. She said she was available Thursday. The meeting lasted 2 hours. She left with a signed letter of agreement. It was not a large contract by anyone's definition of the word, but it was hers. She gave notice at the consulting firm the following Monday. Her supervisor, a man who had consistently underestimated her and who had, just 3 months earlier, passed her over for a senior position in favor of a male colleague with fewer results and more social comfort in that particular office, looked at her across his desk when she handed him her resignation letter and had the expression of a man who has just realized, too late, that he miscalculated something important. She thanked him for the experience, meant it more than he deserved, and walked out of the building with a blue composition notebook under her arm. She registered her consulting firm within 60 days. She named it Henderson Financial Advisory, which was not a flashy name and was not meant to be. It was her name. That was the entire point. The Springfield manufacturing account was her first. A regional food distribution company became her second, referred to by Dale Patterson, who had mentioned her name at a Chamber of Commerce event with the particular enthusiasm of a man who has finally been told what is actually wrong with his company after years of being sold solutions to problems he doesn't have. A third client came through her network within the year, and then 2 more, and then 6, and by the time Henderson Financial Advisory had been operating for 18 months, Claire had more work than she could carry alone and had made the decision to hire her first employee. She was deliberate about who she hired. She was looking for someone specific, not a specific resume, but a specific quality. Someone who was good at the work and had been underestimated by people who should have known better. She found her in a woman named Patricia Okafor, 43 years old, who had spent the last 12 years at a larger Columbus firm doing work that was regularly credited to other people. Claire offered her a salary that was 15% above what the larger firm was paying her and a title that accurately reflected what she actually did. Patricia accepted within 24 hours and stayed for the next 11 years. By the end of year 2, Henderson Financial Advisory had 6 clients and 2 employees. By the end of year 3, 12 clients and 4 employees. Claire was not growing fast for the sake of growing fast. That was a mistake she watched other small firms make, expanding their footprint before their infrastructure was ready to support it, stretching their attention across more accounts than they could genuinely serve well, and then wondering why their best clients started looking for alternatives. She grew at the speed of her ability to maintain quality. She turned down accounts that didn't fit her firm's capacity. She said no to attractive contracts when saying yes would have meant shortchanging existing clients, and she was explicit with prospective clients about why she was saying no, which was the kind of professional honesty that is almost startling when you encounter it and that people remember for a very long time. She was building something with an internal logic, a structure that was designed around the actual work rather than around appearances or ambition for its own sake. And the work, because it was genuinely excellent, kept generating more work. In year 4 she hired 2 more people. One of them was a recent Ohio State graduate named Kevin who had been told in his first job interview after graduation that he was a great candidate for a future opportunity, in a tone that everyone in the room understood to mean something else entirely. The other was a woman named Sandra Wu who had been working as a freelance analyst for 3 years after the firm she had spent 6 years building her expertise that was acquired and restructured in a way that eliminated her position, along with the positions of 11 other people whose institutional knowledge walked out the door with them and was not replaced. Claire interviewed both of them for more than 2 hours each, asking questions that were not on any standard interview guide, questions about how they thought about problems and what they did when they were wrong about something and what kind of professional environment they had found it hardest to work in. She hired them both. They both became consequential members of what would grow into a genuinely exceptional firm. It would be convenient, and it would be the kind of story that certain people want to tell about women who succeed, to say that Claire Henderson never thought about Marcus Cole during those years. That she moved into her new life with the clean, decisive completeness of a woman who had drawn a line and not looked back. But that is not the truth, and this story has no interest in the convenient version. The truth is that she thought about him a great deal in the first 2 years. Not in the consuming way of someone who cannot release a grievance. She was not that kind of woman, and she did not have that kind of relationship with her own emotions, but in the ongoing, investigative way of a person trying to understand something that does not yet make full sense to them. She replayed, at different times and in different lights, the 18 months of their engagement. The things she had noticed and explained away. The conversations that, in retrospect, had a slightly different quality than she had attributed to them at the time. She was not doing this to punish herself. She was a woman who had made a reasonable decision based on the information available to her, and she understood clearly that the failure of that decision was not hers to own. She was doing it because she was constitutionally unable to encounter something she didn't understand without making a genuine effort to understand it. By year 3, she thought about Marcus less. Not because she had forgotten or forgiven exactly. Forgiveness, she had come to understand, was not a single act but a long and nonlinear process, and it was hers to move through on her own timeline and no one else's. She thought about him less because the life she was building had become larger and more consuming and more genuinely interesting than the architecture of her past. She had problems to solve. She had clients who needed her to be fully present. She had a team of people who were counting on her decisions and her judgment, and the responsibility of that was not a burden. It was the most energizing thing she had ever experienced in her professional life. She was building something real. She was building something that had her name on the door and her thinking in the work and her choices at every level of the structure, and there is a specific kind of satisfaction in that which is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, but which people who have experienced it will recognize immediately. It is not the satisfaction of being told you did well. It is the satisfaction of knowing, at the level where you live, below performance and below presentation and below all of the external verification that most of us rely on for our sense of our own worth, that you have done something that mattered, and that you did it yourself. Year 5 brought the first significant expansion. A referral came in through a former mentor of Claire's, a woman named Dr. Foster, who had been her academic advisor at Ohio State and who had gone on to become a consultant herself, and who had been approached by a Fortune 500 company in the manufacturing sector looking for a regional firm to handle due diligence on a potential acquisition. Dr. Foster did not have the bandwidth to take it on herself, and she gave Claire's name without hesitation, calling it, as she later told Claire, the most obvious recommendation I've ever made. Claire took the call. She listened to the scope. The scope was larger than anything Henderson Financial Advisory had managed to that point. It would require a team, a timeline, and a level of coordination that would stretch her current infrastructure. She asked for 48 hours to assess her capacity. She spent those 48 hours not trying to talk herself into something she could not deliver, but genuinely assessing whether she could deliver it. She restructured her current team assignments, identified 2 additional freelance specialists she could bring in for the duration of the project, built a project management framework that accounted for every moving part, and then called the Fortune 500 company back and said yes. The project took 4 months. It was, by the client's assessment given at the end of it, among the most rigorous and thorough due diligence analyses they had ever received from a regional firm. They said this not as a compliment with the implied condescension of for a regional firm, they said it as a straight statement of fact. The work was excellent. The work was the kind of work that gets talked about in the rooms where future work is decided. And 3 months after that project closed, Henderson Financial Advisory received a referral from someone at that Fortune 500 company who had mentioned Claire's name to appear at a different organization, who passed it along to a contact, who turned it into a contract. That is how reputation actually works. Not through marketing or branding or careful positioning, through the quality of the work, traveling through the networks of people who encountered it and trusted what they found. By year 7, the firm had 14 people. By year 8, Claire purchased the building she had been renting office space in, a mid-sized commercial property in a part of Columbus that was being quietly gentrified, which she had watched carefully for 2 years before making the move, understanding that the time to buy is before the neighborhood announces itself. She had the building rewired, the windows replaced, the lobby redesigned to reflect a workspace that was serious about both function and the human beings who worked in it. She put Henderson Financial Advisory on the door in clean, understated letters. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building the morning after the signage went up and looked at it for a long time. Her sister called her that morning because her sister always somehow knew when a milestone was happening, and Claire answered and said she was standing outside her building, and her sister said your building with a very specific emphasis, and neither of them could say anything else for a moment because there was too much in it. In year 10, a regional business publication ran a profile on Henderson Financial Advisory under the headline, "The Most Quietly Formidable Firm in the State." The writer had spent 3 days talking to Claire's clients, her team, her peers in the industry. She had explicitly asked them not to position her as a story about resilience or comeback or the inspiring woman overcomes hardship narrative, because she found those narratives reductive and she was not interested in being anyone's inspiration story. The writer honored that request, mostly. The profile was about the work. The quality of it, the methodology behind it, the specific and measurable outcomes her clients had seen. Claire read it once, the morning it published, over coffee in her building. And then she put it in the bottom drawer of her desk. Not because she wasn't proud, but because the pride for her lived in the work itself, and the profile was only a description of the work, and descriptions of things are never the things themselves. Now, here is where the story turns. And I want you to understand what I mean when I say turns, because this is not the turn of a story that has been building toward a confrontation. This is the turn of a story that has been building toward something much more interesting than that. Because what happens next is not about Claire. At least, not directly. Not at first. What happens next is about Marcus Cole and the particular arithmetic of 15 years of choices made by a man who had never fully reckoned with the most consequential decision of his life. Marcus Cole had built, in Cleveland, a version of a life that looked reasonable from the outside. He had joined the regional property development group he had moved there to work for, and he had performed adequately in that role for the first 4 years. Not exceptionally, adequately. He had the family name and the regional connections and the general professional competence of a man who had grown up around the industry and knew its rhythms without having had to learn them the hard way. He advanced at the expected rate. He was liked in the way that people who are charming and inoffensive tend to be liked, genuinely in some cases, as a matter of professional habit in others. He married a woman named Jennifer in 2004, 3 years after the altar. The marriage was announced in the Columbus papers, which Claire saw. She folded the paper and put it in the recycling and went to work and did not mention it to anyone. Jennifer was a teacher. She was, by all accounts of people who knew them as a couple, a good woman who had the misfortune of loving a man who had not yet done the serious work of understanding what he was capable of. They divorced in 2010. The accounts of why vary depending on who you ask, and this story is not interested in relitigating the details of Marcus Cole's marriage, because Marcus Cole's marriage is not the point of this story. What is the point is what happened to the Cole family business in the years that followed. Marcus's father, Robert Cole, the second-generation patriarch who had grown his father's company into the recognizable regional name it had become, was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease in 2007. The progression was slow at first and then not slow. Robert Cole had spent most of his professional life making the kinds of decisions that are made by men who trust their gut and act on the confidence of family legacy, which works beautifully in good economic conditions and punishingly in difficult ones. By 2008, when the broader financial crisis hit the commercial real estate sector with the force of a collapse that no one in the industry was fully prepared for, the Cole Company was holding significant debt on 3 commercial development projects that had been timed extraordinarily badly. They survived 2008, but just barely, and the survival required a restructuring that meant selling off assets that Robert Cole had spent 30 years accumulating. Marcus, who had returned to Columbus by 2009 to help manage the family business as his father's health declined, found himself at the helm of something much smaller and much more fragile than the company he had grown up believing would always be there. He managed it. To be fair to Marcus Cole, and fairness is what this story is committed to, even where he is concerned, he managed it with more seriousness than anyone who knew his earlier self might have expected. He tightened the operation. He made hard decisions about staff. He brought in outside counsel on the debt structure. He pulled the company back from the edge of collapse, not dramatically, not in any way that made for a good story, but in the grinding, incremental, day-by-day way that actual business survival usually works. The company stabilized. It did not grow. The era of Cole family real estate growth was, for all practical purposes, over, but it stabilized. And Marcus told himself, and maybe believed, that stabilization was enough. It was not enough. The deeper problem, the one that took longer to reveal itself, was structural. The commercial development sector that the coal company had built its identity around was changing in ways that a mid-size regional player with an aging portfolio and limited capital for innovation was not well positioned to navigate. New competitors entered the market. Standards for due diligence on commercial projects tightened in ways that required a level of financial sophistication that the coal operation's internal resources could not easily provide. Marcus hired and fired 2 different financial advisors in 3 years, both times because the relationship produced good-sounding analyses that did not translate into actionable guidance. He began, slowly and with a kind of pride that makes men resist admitting what they need, to understand that what his company required was something he could not produce internally. By 2014, 13 years after the altar, 2 years after Claire's firm had been profiled in the regional business press and 1 year after Henderson Financial Advisory had crossed the threshold of 30 employees, the coal company was carrying a level of debt that had become, again, genuinely alarming. The trigger was a commercial project in the Columbus suburb of Westerville, a mixed-use development that had been in planning for 3 years and that represented the largest single investment the coal company had made in over a decade. 2 of the 3 anchor tenants who had signed letters of intent had, in the final months before groundbreaking, withdrawn. Without those anchors, the financing structure of the project could not hold. The lead investor on the development, a private equity group out of Cincinnati, was prepared to stay involved, but only under 2 conditions. The first was a restructuring of the debt schedule. The second was an independent third-party due diligence review of the entire financial framework of the coal company, conducted by a firm the investor would specify. Marcus Cole's younger brother, Thomas, handled most of the investor communications by that point. Thomas was, in the family's internal accounting, the more straightforward of the 2, less charming than Marcus but more honest, which had cost him some professional relationships over the years and had ultimately been worth it. When the investor named the firm they wanted brought in for the due diligence review, Thomas was the one who received the email. He read it. He read it again. He sat at his desk in the family business's Columbus office for about 4 minutes, and then he picked up his phone and called Marcus. He said, "I need you to sit down for this." Marcus said he was already sitting down. Thomas said, "That's good." And then he told him the name of the firm. The firm that the investor had identified as the most trusted independent analyst in the state for exactly this type of commercial restructuring. The firm whose reputation had been built, over 15 years of exceptional work, by a woman named Claire Henderson. Marcus Cole went silent on the phone. Thomas, who had known his brother for his entire life and who was not entirely unaware of what had happened in that church 13 years earlier, let the silence exist for a moment and then said, "I know." Marcus said nothing for another moment. And then he said, "How many days do we have?" Thomas said 4. Marcus said he needed to think. Thomas said they did not have the luxury of extended thinking. Marcus said he understood that. He hung up the phone. He did not call Thomas back for 3 days. He was not, in those 3 days, doing what Thomas was afraid he was doing. He was not catastrophizing or shutting down. He was doing something harder and more honest than that. He was sitting with the full weight of what the situation required and what it meant. He was, perhaps for the first time in a serious way, reckoning with the choices he had made and the chain of consequence those choices had produced that now led, with an almost poetic directness, to this specific moment. He could feel the geometry of it. The way the road he had chosen in 2001 had bent, over 15 years, back toward the road he had walked away from. On the 4th day he sent the meeting request himself. His assistant composed the email and he reviewed it and changed 3 words, which is how Marcus communicated things he did not know how to say directly, through small, careful edits to language other people had written. The meeting request was professional, formal, brief. It gave no personal context. It described the coal company and the nature of the consulting need and asked for an initial availability conversation at Henderson Financial Advisory's convenience. He sent it at 9:17 in the morning. He then spent the rest of the morning in a state of attention he described to Thomas afterward as like waiting for a verdict. He had no expectation of what she would do. He had not been able, in 3 days of private reflection, to determine what the right response would be or what response she would be justified in giving. All he knew was that he had sent the request, and that what happened next was not up to him. For a man who had always arranged his life to maintain control of what happened next, that was a genuinely unfamiliar experience. Claire Henderson saw the meeting request at 9:32 in the morning on a Tuesday. She read it twice. She recognized the company name immediately. Cole Family Holdings LLC was well known in the Columbus commercial real estate community, and she had been aware, in the general way of someone who pays attention to her professional environment, that it had been experiencing difficulties. She recognized his name in the signature line. She sat for a moment. Then she forwarded the email to her lead analyst, Patricia Okafor, with 3 words in the body of the forward: "Can you review?" Patricia called her within the hour. Claire asked her to pull everything publicly available on Cole Family Holdings. Patricia said she would have it by end of day. She did. Claire read it that evening at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while she was reading. She went to bed at 11. She slept. She was that kind of woman. The next morning she confirmed the meeting. She gave no personal indication in her reply that the name of the person making the request meant anything beyond what the request itself communicated. She confirmed a date and time. She asked her assistant to prepare the conference room. She asked Patricia to be present in a supporting capacity. And then she went back to the rest of her work, because she had a full day of it, and because Claire Henderson had a long practice of not allowing the personal to colonize the professional in ways that served neither. She did not tell her staff who Marcus Cole was. She did not tell Patricia. She had considered both and decided against it, not out of any desire to protect him but out of a clear-eyed sense that the professional interaction should be exactly what it presented itself as, a potential client with a legitimate business need, evaluated on the merits of that need. The history between her and the man who was about to walk into her conference room was real, but it was hers. It did not belong to the meeting. To walk into her conference room was real, but it was hers. It did not belong to the meeting. She had a clean and functional way of separating the things that belonged to her privately from the things that belonged to the work, and she had been practicing that separation for 15 years. She was very good at it. He arrived 6 minutes early. The assistant showed him into the glass-walled waiting room on the top floor of the Henderson Financial Advisory Building. He sat. He was wearing a well-cut charcoal suit. His hair had gone partially gray at the temples, which was either distinguished or simply age, depending on how you were inclined to read it. He held a leather portfolio on his knee. He was visibly managing himself, and if you knew what to look for, and Claire, who had spent 15 years reading the body language of people in rooms where they were under pressure, had a highly developed understanding of what to look for, you would have recognized it immediately. The particular stillness of a man who is not calm but is working very hard at appearing calm. He looked at the awards on the wall. He looked at the lobby. He looked at the staff moving past with the efficiency and confidence of people who are good at their jobs and know it. He looked at everything except his own hands. His best men had been like that at the altar. She had not noticed it then. She would have noticed it now. She came out of her office to collect him herself, rather than sending the assistant. This was not unusual. She did it with some clients as a matter of warmth, not protocol, but it was deliberate in this case. She walked to the lobby door, opened it, and said his name. He stood. They looked at each other across the space of approximately 4 feet for the first time in 13 years. She extended her hand. He took it. She said it was good of him to come in, and she said it in exactly the tone she would have used with any other potential client, which was pleasant and professional and contained nothing that could be described as performance in either direction. He said thank you for making the time. His voice was controlled in the way of someone working to keep it controlled. They walked together down the corridor toward the conference room, and she pointed out briefly a framed photograph on the wall her team from the first year, 9 people, taken in the lobby of the building they had outgrown, and said something light about how much had changed since then, and he looked at the photograph and then at her and said quietly, "You've built something remarkable," and she said, "Thank you, Marcus. We have," with a very particular emphasis on the word we that had nothing theatrical about it, but that was precise and intentional. And then they went into the conference room. The meeting lasted 92 minutes. Patricia Okafor was present for the first 45, her yellow legal pad filling steadily with notes and questions. Claire ran the meeting with the precision of someone who had conducted hundreds of these engagements and knew exactly what she needed to understand and in what order she needed to understand it. She asked about the Westerville project timeline. She asked about the debt schedule on the existing portfolio. She asked about the investor group's appetite for restructuring risk. She asked questions that went to the core of what had happened and what was needed, and Marcus answered them. He was forthcoming in a way that she had not entirely expected, not performing competence but acknowledging difficulty in a way that was more honest than she had seen from him in 2 years of a relationship. He had, she would realize later, learned something in the years since she had known him. Whether that learning had come early enough to matter for his company remained to be seen. At the 45-minute mark, Patricia excused herself to pull an additional document, and there was a pause in the meeting, and Marcus set down his pen. He looked at the surface of the table for a moment. And then he looked at her. And he said, "I think I owe you something I've owed you for a long time." She held his gaze. She did not help him. She did not fill the space with the kind of easing words that would have let him arrive at the acknowledgement less directly. She let him carry it himself, because it was his to carry. He said, "What I did, what happened at the church, I never gave you an explanation. Or an apology. And I am aware that it's 13 years late, and that coming here to ask for something makes it even more complicated, and I'm not asking you to," she stopped him. Not sharply. Calmly. She said, "Marcus. I know." And then she was quiet for a moment, and what she said next, she said in the steady and measured voice of a woman who has lived with something long enough that she owns it completely, not as a wound but as a fact. She said that she had been angry for a long time. Not loudly. The kind of anger that lives underneath the surface of things and shapes choices in ways you don't always recognize until you're looking backward. She said she had spent 2 years trying to understand why he had done what he did, and then she had stopped because the why did not change the what, and the what had already changed her. She said that she had not known at the time what she was about to build. She had not known, on the floor of that bathroom in the church vestibule, that the worst moment of her adult life was also the last morning of the version of herself that would have been content with a smaller life. She said she did not credit him with building what she had built. She built it herself, and that was true and important, and she would not give the credit for it to anyone else, least of all to the person whose choices had simply changed her context. But she said, and this is the part that the people who later heard the story at second and third hand always struggled to fully believe, that she was sitting across from him now in a building she owned, in a firm she had built, in a life she had constructed out of something she had not chosen, and that life was, by any honest measure, better than the one she had been walking toward on October 13, 2001. Not because of what he did. In spite of it. And then she picked up her pen. And she said, "Now. The debt structure on the Westerville project. I want to understand the restructuring timeline from the investor's side." He didn't speak for a moment. And then he nodded. And they finished the meeting. When Marcus Cole left the building that afternoon, he stopped for a moment on the sidewalk outside. He looked up at the sign on the building. Henderson Financial Advisory, in clean letters on a facade. He had just spent 2 hours inside, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had become. He stood there for a while. Long enough that a woman coming out of the building behind him had to step around him on the sidewalk. He did not notice. He was doing something that he would not have been capable of doing 13 years earlier. He was looking fully and without mitigation at what his choices had produced and what her choices had produced, and he was holding both truths in the same hand. It was not a comfortable thing. It was, perhaps, the most honest moment he had had in a very long time. Patricia Okafor came to Claire's office at the end of that day. The rest of the afternoon had been full. 2 calls, a team meeting, a review session on another client's quarterly, and sat down across her desk. She had the file on Cole Family Holdings in front of her. She said the deal was legitimate. The debt structure was solvable. The restructuring work was squarely in their wheelhouse. The numbers, she said, actually worked in everyone's favor. Then she paused. And she looked at Claire. And she said, "Do you want me to reach out to another firm to refer this one to? I can do it without it being apparent where the referral came from. He'd never need to know." Claire looked at her for a long moment. Patricia, who had worked with her for 11 years and who knew her better than almost anyone in her professional life, held the look without flinching, because she understood that she had offered something real and that real offers deserve real consideration. Claire said she needed a few minutes. Patricia said of course and stood to leave. And then Claire said, "Close the door, please." Patricia closed the door. She sat alone in her office for a little over an hour. Not agonizing. Not performing deliberation. Thinking, in the careful and honest way she brought to every decision that mattered. The The question in front of her was not whether she could take the contract. She could. The question was not whether the work was worthy of her firm. It was. The question, the real question, was the one she had been living with for 15 years in various forms, and which had resolved itself so slowly and quietly that she had not fully noticed the resolution until now. It was a question about what she wanted the ending of this chapter of her life to look like, not for him, not for the story that other people would tell about her, but for herself. For the person she had been becoming since the floor of that bathroom. And she understood, sitting alone in her office in the building she owned as the late afternoon light came through the windows at an angle that made the whole room look gold, that the answer was not complicated. It had not been complicated for a while. She had simply been waiting for an occasion clear enough to recognize it in. She took the contract. She assigned a team. She set a timeline. She communicated the terms, her firm's standard terms, to Marcus in a formal letter from her office, signed with her full name. The work began the following Monday. The Westerville restructuring was completed on schedule and within budget, which was what Henderson Financial Advisory always delivered and which was not contingent on who the client was. Marcus was professional throughout. He was, it was clear, genuinely trying to show her who he had become in the way that a person can only show another person who they are through behavior over time, and she observed it with a clarity she brought to all observations and credited it for what it was worth, which was evidence of growth without being evidence that made any claim on her beyond the professional engagement they had entered. The coal company stabilized. The Westerville project found new anchor tenants within the restructured framework. The investor group remained involved. The outcome was, by every relevant metric, a success. Henderson Financial Advisory received their full fee on the contracted timeline. The professional relationship ended there. It ended there because that is where it was supposed to end, and Claire had known that from the moment she had sat alone in her office and decided to take the work. 6 months later, Marcus sent a personal message. He said in straightforward and unadorned language that he wanted her to know that he was aware of what it had cost her to take the contract and that he was grateful in a way he had not had enough time to say while the professional interaction was ongoing. He said he hoped she knew he understood if she had no interest in hearing this from him, but he wanted to say it, that what he had done on that day in October of 2001 was the worst decision of his life, and that he had understood it as such long before circumstances had required him to sit across from her in a conference room and see its full cost clearly. He said he did not expect a response. Claire read the message. She did not respond. Not because she was angry. Because there was nothing left to say. The chapter had closed. She had closed it, on her own terms, in the way she chose. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. Here's what I want to say to you now, directly, because I think it matters and because the kind of story we just told each other deserves more than a summary. Most of us, most women, if I am being specific, have some version of what Claire Henderson experienced. Not the altar, necessarily, but the organizing of life around something that turned out not to hold. The trusting of someone with the parts of yourself you protect most carefully, and the having of that trust treated as disposable. Having to start over quietly, without an audience or a roadmap or any particular reason given to believe that what you are starting over toward will be better than what you lost. We know what that weight feels like, even when we have not spoken about it to anyone, even when we have managed it entirely in private, even when the people around us did not fully know what we were carrying. We know. And what Claire's story tells us, what I hope you are leaving this video with, is not that the story has a satisfying ending because the man came back. The satisfying part is not him. The satisfying part is her. The fact that by the time he walked into her building, she had been so completely and fully herself for so long that his presence was simply a business meeting. That is the arrival. Not the contract. Not the confrontation. The moment when the thing that was done to you is simply no longer the most important thing about you. She built that arrival over 15 years. Not in one dramatic turn, but in the accumulated weight of thousands of ordinary decisions made in ordinary moments. The decision to stay, to show up, to keep the notebook, to make the phone call at 7 in the morning, to hire the right people, to say no to the wrong contracts. To own the building, to run the meeting the way it deserved to be run. She did not build it to prove anything to Marcus Cole. She built it because she was a woman who, once she understood what she was capable of, could not stop herself from seeing how far that capability would take her. And it took her very far. It took her to the top floor of a building with her name on it, with a team of people who were good at their work and knew it, with a practice built on the simple and radical conviction that excellent work is its own argument. That is what 15 years of choosing yourself over and over, in the small and large ways and the visible and invisible ways, actually looks like from the inside. And from the outside, for anyone paying attention, it looks exactly like what it is. It looks like someone who decided that the worst morning of her life was not going to be the one she was remembered by. Claire Henderson is, at the time of this account, 49 years old. She lives in Columbus, Ohio, in a house she purchased herself, on a street she has walked every single morning for 11 years. Her company operates in 4 states. She employs 31 people, all of whom know that she remembers their birthdays, and the names of their children, and the details of whatever they told her mattered most to them when they joined the firm. She serves on 2 regional advisory boards. She has never given a TED Talk about resilience. She has never turned her story into a brand. She answers her own emails when they require a real answer. She still keeps composition notebooks not blue anymore. She switched to green in year 6 for no reason she can fully account for, and she still writes in them the things she notices about how businesses work and fail and recover and surprise her. She will tell you, if you ask her about the morning in October of 2001, that it was a very difficult period and that she came out of it with a company and a life she could not have imagined at the time, and that she does not credit Marcus Cole with that outcome and does not blame him for it either, which is the most precise and honest position available on the subject, and which tells you everything about the kind of mind she has brought to bear on every problem she has ever encountered. She is, by any accounting, one of the most formidable people in her professional community. And she is, by any accounting, exactly who she was always going to be. It just took a door closing loudly, in front of 400 people, to show her the room she was supposed to be in. Now, I want to hear from you, because the women who watch this channel always give the most honest responses, and I read them because they matter to me. If you were Claire Henderson, do you take that contract when Marcus Cole's name comes across your desk 15 years later? Or do you refer it to another firm and close that door completely? There is no wrong answer. I genuinely want to know where you land. And for those of you who are willing to go a little deeper in the comments, has there been a moment in your own life where the thing you thought was breaking you turned out to be the beginning of something you could not have reached any other way? You do not have to share the details. Even just yes in the comments tells me something I think is worth knowing. And if you have a story, and I believe many of you do, tell me. This channel is a space for stories that deserve to be told. And if you are new here, welcome. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. We are here every week with the kind of human situations that change how you see the world and, if you're lucky, how you see yourself. I'll see you in the next one.